Professor Hudson, who many of you know from last year's presentation. She was the only presenter that got an applause midstream in her presentation. Valerie is not a timid skull, so she was a paratrooper, and degrees from Ohio State University, political science professor, long list of awards because of her productive research and her publications. Some of you may remember that she gave a great publication, a great presentation on sex-selective infanticide in China and India, and how this is a matter of social instability and even national security. More recently, she's been researching on the security implications of surplus male population. Was recently, just a week or two, at the United Nations. She'll tell you about some of her research, I anticipate, and it's getting to be known, it's significant, and she will let them introduce what their topics will be. First, Karen Heyer.
I'd like to just talk for a minute while Valerie puts her PowerPoint on, and I think mine is on here, right? Okay, we'll find out. What I'm going to share with you, use the microphone. I'll sit down and do it while she's doing that. It's working? No, it's not working.
Maybe you flipped it off.
Oh, well. Anyway, I'll shout. Just listening to Professor Heaton's discussion and his student who gave a good presentation on poverty, thinking back as LDS people on Brigham Young and his emphasis on education of women and the importance of having educated women in our community. I think education is a key for the church in terms of its development and in terms of being able to uplift the entire population. I made some notes. A key to a strong family is the woman. We have in terms of growing the children, teaching them various skills. And I'd like to say, that women are, the women of the church are the greatest human capital that the church has. Okay. Now, where are we? This is the end. Okay, we're, doesn't look like it's. I'm going to talk about global issues facing women in general, and I'm going to base it on the on a conference that we had here at. Let's see. Slideshow. There we go. Sorry. We didn't have our little 5 minutes to set up here. In October, the Women's Research Institute, headed by Bonnie Ballas-Banville here, invited a number of women researchers, and there was also a man who was a researcher on issues regarding education and women. And we had a noted scholar, Dr. Nellie Stromquist, come from the University of Southern California and give us our keynote, which got us all talking for 2 days. So what I'm going to share with you are the results of that. There is a publication that will be coming out next month. I'm just going to overview some of the information in that chapter that discusses what some of the major issues are for women around the world, because this does impact the church. I wanted to say one thing based on what Professor Heaton's talk was ended with. In terms of education, one of the questions. Education being a better predictor of success than literacy. Education is a system. As a convert, I know that the church is an educational system. The church spends a lot of time and resources on developing a very strong educational system that is highly coordinated. As a convert, I had to learn a new language. I had to learn a whole lot of procedures that were not... I was raised in a traditional Christian church, the Episcopal Church to be specific. And we had rituals and we had certain... and education was highly developed, but not nearly as developed as the LDS Church educational program for members. If you think of what you do on Sundays and how that LDS lifestyle is what it is. It's not just go to church on Sunday. It's all during the week and 24/7. So it is a system that teaches. So those members who join in poor places, and we have seen this, my husband and I have been in some very, very poor places representing the church, and we've seen over a period of years how membership in the church does help people achieve. Because it's a system of behavior, of knowledge, of literacy. It's all put together. So it's a wonderful system for that. Around the world, the international situation of women, you have many countries where there are not democratic rights. There are salary differentials still in all countries, including this one. Reproductive and health rights are absent or severely restricted in many places. There are compounded effects of gender, social class, ethnicity, and poverty all put together with regard to women. And there's a lack of solidarity of women across social class and ethnicity. This is one great thing that the Relief Society does, is it pulls everybody together in the church, and it's one of the advantages we have. The situation of women's education, there is improved enrollment throughout the world because there have been several international initiatives. There's a greater pace of enrollment among women because there's a lot of emphasis on it. There are considerable disparities, though, in sub-Saharan Africa, West and South Asia. There is gender parity pretty much in Latin America at all levels, including the highest levels. There's a gender gap in science and technology in the industrialized world. Now, some of you are familiar with these global educational policy initiatives, what they call the EFA. It's the UNESCO Education for All goals, and they emphasize primarily access, now remember that word, to basic education, gender parity in primary and secondary schools, and reduction of illiteracy. The MDGs, this was the United Nations, came out with the Millennium Development Goals, and it's basically the same sort of thing. Access to basic education, gender parity at all levels, and empowerment of women. Now these are goals. Most countries are not going to make these goals. There has been a major emphasis on school access, no reference to knowledge or content, no reference to hidden curricula in certain tribal areas and whatever. Assumption of schooling as a neutral process, and for women it definitely is not. Confusion between equality and equity. Limited attention to or narrow definition of quality. And gender not part of major educational policies. How many of you have ever experienced any kind of training in gender differences in classrooms or in any type of interaction? A few. Okay. And yet you are leaders, and this is not unusual. Most leaders do not have training in these areas, and so it's very difficult to create educational policies that will be helpful. Now, in developing countries, you have certain gender problems, and in industrialized countries, others. For example, in developing countries, it's one more element in a long list of disabilities and liabilities. The concept of gender is seldom defined, and gender is not defended as a priority, and limited efforts to retrain teachers and modify the curriculum. In industrialized countries, there are minor efforts to retrain teachers and modify the curriculum. So we are familiar with a lot of the mathematics education and science initiatives that are about now that have studied and found that girls after a certain age, particularly when they're with boys, they all of a sudden they're not intelligent anymore, or teachers don't encourage them. There's a whole milieu of activities in the classroom setting that discourage girls from going into these fields, and it becomes a big problem for industrialized nations, especially this one where we're migrating in a lot of our higher level science people. Protection against sexual harassment. It's been talked about in this country a lot, but it's something that is still a big problem elsewhere. Key problem defined as small representation of women in science and engineering. That's in industrialized countries. There are some competing forces with regard to improving the education for women. Academicians and others, in other words, some women are looking at certain aspects of it, and other women, we just had a discussion of how the local community sometimes has a different view as to what is needed. Even having things in their own language. Women are seen as motherhood, femininity, and family, and often not realizing that education is very important for all of those three roles. Globalization, values of individualism, and then we have the international and domestic wars that are going on in many areas, and women are often the victims in those areas, women and girls. We had this Sundance Summit in 2005 in October, and we invited a group of international scholars. We prepared recommendations, and those recommendations are going to be in a book now. In terms of these are some data from two major studies. I just pulled out some of the most obvious numbers that you have 862 million illiterate people in the world. 2/3, or 600 million of these people, are women. 60 million girls ages 6 to 11 are out of school, often working for their families or in other situations. 100 million current schoolgirls will drop out before completing primary school, and only 76% of girls worldwide complete school. So access may not be the issue. Emphasis on completion and knowledge base is perhaps more important. Lack of equality. In 65 developing countries, 50% have achieved gender parity in primary education. That's pretty good. That's since those goals have been set out by the United Nations. 20% in secondary education and 8% in higher education. Only 5 countries have reached that 8% level. Now you saw some of that same thing in those others. In 2 other presentations they have indicated similar data. And in sub-Saharan Africa, only 1 in 5 girls enroll in secondary education. There's an unequal status of women around the world. Just in terms of leadership, 16% of parliamentary seats worldwide, 75% of all people with disabilities are women, 1% literacy among disabled women and girls. So I just pulled out a few of these things. The summit had some critique of gender conceptualization. I've mentioned that it's not defined. It's not a priority. The role of power in these different cultures is overlooked, and women are seen as a homogeneous category, and we know that is not true. Assumptions that education system is gender neutral, and it is not, and narrow definition of women's empowerment. Specific policy impacts on women's education is this emphasis on enrollment, and that's what you're going to see when you look at most of these reports. They talk about gross enrollment. They don't break it down, rather than looking at completion rates and attainment of knowledge. They focus on access to schooling rather than transformation of educational institutions to meet the needs of the people there. Limited attention to gender issues in school, domestic violence, for example, reproductive health, self-esteem. Many girls in Africa don't want to go to school because of the violence that is and sexual harassment that is a part of their educational system. Other girls in parts of the world, Middle Eastern areas and whatever, they don't want to go to school because the latrine situation is not set up so that it's friendly to women and girls, particularly after they start their menses. It's not private, and it's a problem with cleanliness, so they don't go. So these are little things that I think the church needs to be sensitive to in terms of their educational situation. Lack of gender training for teachers in gender-responsive classrooms, making policy decisions on gender without input of women's civic organizations or widespread community involvement. Overlooking gender gaps in science and technology, the limited opportunities for continuing education, and inequity of employment. And viewing women's education as a way to achieve economic progress rather than an innate human right. So best practices for equity, gender-sensitive classroom, teaching in the local language, recruiting more female teachers, flexible lesson scheduling. Someone mentioned people didn't go to church because of the distance. Well, imagine young girls going at a late hour across long, distant areas in the countryside. It's very, very dangerous for them in most places, and so this is a lot of parents are very concerned about that. So flexible scheduling would be a way to manage some of that. Effective teaching styles that consider the needs of boys and girls. Interesting research. If attention is given to girls' education and making educational situations more appealing to girls, it also helps boys. So this isn't just, do it for the girls and the boys suffer. That has been the case the other way around, but when they attend to the girls and the needs of the girls, it always has helped the boys. Providing food and health programs in schools because they don't get it at home or their communities, and decreasing girls' domestic workloads. Girls, as their mothers often, work all day, go home, and have another job. And girls are very heavily dependent upon by their families for domestic work. Moving schools closer to children. I think the suggestion of a small little hut maybe was something that hit my ear because Paul and I were involved several years ago in setting up little huts in the back areas of China because didn't cost very much, but they had nothing. They would be scratching their characters out on the sand in some of these areas. So providing some type of school close by is important. Making schools girl-friendly, and I mentioned some of the things there. Mobilizing community support for girls' education. There are some communities that don't believe that girls should be educated. The LDS community stood out amongst others in the last century, or the century before, by putting an emphasis on the importance of educating women. And then trying to remove gender bias and providing incentives for girls to attend. Costs of schooling. These are barriers, armed conflict, and internal displacement. We've talked about that with regard to poverty. Bias against rural education. This was mentioned in the last report, where the urban areas get more emphasis. Race, ethnicity, religion and caste, disability, violence and security issues, a big issue for educating girls. Social and cultural attitudes towards girls' education. And then there are some problems in implementing the solutions. You've got lack of gender knowledge by policymakers and leaders, male perceptions and biases about women's issues, women are not empowered to influence policy changes, role of media in generating gender stereotypes. We heard Dan talk about how the Middle East sees us in certain views because our movies are generating certain stereotypes. And there have been many studies on gender stereotyping of women, even in this country, and even in law school, and we've done some work at the Women's Research Institute on that. Competing gender agendas and weak communication among women's groups about research findings. There are some potential solutions. You've got to mobilize the policymakers as change agents, undertake an approach to gender education that coordinates the global policies with the local realities. And you need to develop partnerships through coordination and collaboration. And with the North-South concept, you probably are all familiar with that. The Northern Hemisphere, more developed countries, and the Southern Hemisphere, less developed usually. You need to hold international donors accountable for increasing education budgets. Rather than more tractors, sometimes more tractors just mean that the women work harder in the field gathering the things that have been harvested. And you need to balance and expand research in gender education. We have, here's a reference to that book if you're interested at all. The chapter 5 in that will discuss some of these things in more detail, and in fact some other things I didn't mention. I just want to kind of go through this quickly for you.
I'm happy to be here today. Paul Heyer is always been an inspiration to me. In fact, there's a group of us who've always considered Paul to be a bodhisattva, who has ageless, timeless, and remains here on earth to help the rest of us poor mortals stumble through our mortal trials. So I was delighted when he asked me to come and share the podium with Karen Heyer, who has also been a great example and inspiration to me as well. I'd like to tell you a little bit about some global issues concerning women, and then a special BYU project that's been developed to try to address some of these. And you have to forgive me because I have a Mac. So, all right, let's see. Come on now. Okay. Karen, help me out here. What do I do with this stupid thing? Slideshow? Slides. Yeah. All right. There we go. All right. Cool. The whole world turned to Macs. It'd be a better place. That's right. Yeah. Of course, then we get all the viruses that Microsoft currently deals with. All right. I'd like to start from a premise that I believe all of you will agree with, which is that the restored gospel of Jesus Christ proclaims that men and women are equal partners. Right? And I think this is really one of the revolutionary aspects of our gospel. The strong, strong doctrine about that men and women stand before the Lord as equals, and in life they were meant to be equal partners. And as you can imagine, there are many, many places in the world where this would be considered almost a heretical type of message. And what I'd like to ask today is, in societies where women are considered the inferiors of men, what kinds of things do we see? I'd like to first talk about some research findings here. Research has found that the status of women is strongly correlated with national economic performance and economic output. The status of women is strongly correlated with child survival and malnutrition. Development programs that help improve the status of women are more successful than those which do not address gender. A lower status for women is strongly correlated with measures of political corruption. When women participate in the political process, that increases the level of trust among the citizens in their government. Women's political participation has been shown to increase the attention paid to social welfare, legal protections, and transparency in government. In a great study by Steve Fish out at Berkeley, he found in his survey of Islamic nations that in Islamic nations where the status of women was lower than in other Islamic nations, those particular nations suffered more from internal instability and had more authoritarian governments. We've also discovered that nations practicing female infanticide or sex-selective abortion, and thus have very abnormal sex ratios, were at greater risk for political and social instability and criminal activity. We have also discovered that nations with a higher status for women engaged in fewer military disputes, had lower levels of aggression, and were more likely not to be the first to use force in a dispute. And the presence of women in negotiations was associated with de-escalation of interstate crisis. I think that the world is beginning to see something that I think Latter-day Saints already know. Kofi Annan stated it in 2006, the world is starting to grasp that there is no policy more effective in promoting development, health, and education than the empowerment of women and girls. And I would venture that no policy is more important in preventing conflict or in achieving reconciliation after a conflict has ended. It's amazing that it took us till 2006 to kind of begin to see that. We have begun to see this idea that the status of women may in fact be a foundational linchpin for all sorts of variables. We begin to see that moving into the broader political discourse. Laura Bush, at the time that we invaded Afghanistan, said, "The fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women. The brutal oppression of women is a central goal of terrorism." Jean Bethke-Elshtain, who was honored here at BYU last year, "We underestimate the centrality of the gender question at our peril. Gender practices are not a sidebar to the war against terrorism as a cultural struggle, but a central issue." In 2000, the Security Council passed Resolution 1325 that mandated as standard practice that women be involved in all decisions concerning war and peace, including having a prominent place at the negotiating table. I think that a recent book that I picked up at an airport, actually on my way back from the UN, really paints this picture very well. If you haven't picked it up, when you get to the airport, Salt Lake Airport, to go back to wherever you're going to, pick up Ayaan Hirsi Ali's book, Infidel, which I think is a very dramatic portrayal of how the violence that is not only tolerated but sanctioned against women in certain traditional societies absolutely has a bearing on such things as stability and health and so forth. Could it be that many of the things we value so dearly, freedom, security, prosperity, development, stability, peace, health, for the nations of the world are all dependent, ultimately, on the status of women in society? Do nations treat their women badly because they are poor and unstable, or are nations poor and unstable because they treat their women badly? Okay. I think it's time that we turn that question on the head and begin to answer it. Is it possible then that, that didn't translate from Mac very well. I'm sorry about that. Women as inferior other is actually woman as inferior other. When you have traditional beliefs that see women as others that are inferior, perhaps even a different species, perhaps on a par with livestock, and we see discrimination and violence against women, that kind of mindset begins to perpetuate, does that not have a bearing on the development of violent societal norms within society, with ramifications for things such as domestic repression of outgroups as well as intra and interstate conflict? And we believe there is a link. Okay, last year, 2006, the Geneva Center put out a bulletin, and they said, responding to the report that deaths from war had decreased significantly since the Cold War, they said, you know what hasn't decreased? Do you know what has increased? Deaths of women. And they labeled the phenomenon gendercide. Now, of course, they were trying to use a little bit of a sensationalist term, but as you look at phenomena in the world, it's hard not to admit that there is, in fact, a slaughter of Eve going on. Human and sex trafficking, at least 800,000 a year is the best estimate, 70% of those women. Female genital mutilation, 4 million of those practices perpetrated per year. Female infanticide and sex-selective abortion, over 100 million women missing in Asia. Dowry deaths, and now the new acid attacks that have increased in frequency in South and Southwest Asia. Honor killings. Rape in war, even rape by peacekeepers. You know that the UN recently decreased the amount of money that it gives to the UN Peacekeeping Operations Department because of substantiated reports of maltreatment of women and girls by UN peacekeepers that have been sent in to reverse the damage of war, but in fact have re-emphasized it. 80% of refugees are women and children living in often squalid conditions. I'm sure you are aware that in many countries there are highly inequitable laws concerning marriage, divorce, fidelity, inheritance, custody of children, testimony in court, citizenship, and so forth. Most women in traditional societies have no right to refuse sex in an age of AIDS, and that has led to the statistics we see where 2/3 to 3/4 of those infected in sub-Saharan Africa are women. I won't go into practices such as widow cleansing and widow inheritance, which are also very oppressive of women. Very early marriage in certain areas of the world, with girls being married off at ages 8 to 9, with resulting terrible problems when they have children, usually at age 11 or 12, with vesicovaginal fistulae. Astounding maternal mortality in some countries. For example, in some regions of Saharan Africa, the rate is a 1 in 16 lifetime risk of dying in childbirth. As Karen pointed out, 2/3 of the world's illiterates are women, but another statistic is 2/3 of the world's malnourished children are girls. And then the epidemic of domestic violence, which even reaches into the most industrialized countries. One of my research assistants discovered that the rate of reported domestic violence in Vienna, Austria is the same as the rate of reported domestic violence in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And of course, even here in Utah, 2/3 of Utah's murders are domestic violence. Perhaps it's time for us to think about how we could see, speak, teach, and act about these things, given our foundation of LDS doctrine concerning the equality, equal worth and value of men and women. The restored gospel of Jesus Christ is the strongest, most progressive force for women in the world. And one of the things that I'd like to point out, especially to this audience, where the majority are men, is, for example, where in the world could you find a group of men who are dedicated to a single standard of sexual fidelity, committed to marriage and staying married, committed to upholding the equality and safety and flourishing of women? Where can you find men who are dedicated to having children and actively taking part in raising them, in valuing their daughters as much as they value their sons? Men dedicated to an abhorrence of abuse, pornography, and neglect, dedicated to parity and burden sharing, including housework and decision-making within marriage, and the same parity at the national level. You know, it's you men who hold the priesthood of the LDS Church are an amazing group of men. There is no like group of men who can answer all of these questions in the affirmative as you can, that exist in the world. There simply aren't. So I would like to remind you of how special you are on the face of this planet, and ask whether or not you, this special covenant group of men, are willing to speak up for women and act for the betterment of the world's women. And I think if you do, you will have the gratitude of your Heavenly Father, who surely loves his daughters just as much as he loves his sons, and must weep to send his daughters to such a world where they will suffer such indignities and violence. Now, there's also an urgent need, and this is an academician I can start to address, if I can get these. Despite the progress in recent years, there is still an urgent need to strengthen the knowledge base on all forms of violence against women to inform policy and strategy development. Both policymakers and activists have called for the development of a comprehensive set of international indicators on violence against women. More and better quality data on women are needed to guide national policies and programs and monitor states' progress in addressing violence. Well, it's time for something that we call the Woman Stats Project at BYU. Because we have felt so deeply that our doctrine urges us to speak up for women and to show these links between the status of women and the security, prosperity, stability, freedom, health, and so forth of women, we have developed what is already the world's largest database on the status of women. We examined 245 variables on the status of women for 172 nations, which are all the nations with at least 200,000 population. And those variables break out into 9 clusters, such as physical security, economic security, legal security, security in their community, security in their families, security in maternity, security through voice in society, security through societal investment in women, and women's security in the state. Now let's see here if I can do this right. Is that right? Let's see. No. Screen? All right, I don't know how to do it. Let's see. I'll simply end, and let's see. We believe the fate of the world depends on the fate of the world's women. And we can see that with Woman Stats. So let me pull up the Woman Stats homepage. Here's our homepage here. And we are in the process of uploading all of our data to the database. We have some tutorials on how to use the site, overview of the project, a list of all of our 245 variables, board of directors that includes not only female professors but also male professors, and not only here at BYU but also at other universities in our country. And we're also starting to put some of our research up on the web. So for example, our wonderful undergraduate coders have recently done some coding on women's physical security. Okay, and the lighter countries, the tan countries where women are physically secure, you see there is no tan country. And high levels of physical security, we've got a few pinks. Medium levels of physical security, low levels of physical security, and in the black, very darkest, women lack physical security. So this is one way to sort of see what's going on with women. And the geography department has helped us with this. Here's trafficking of females. Lightest countries, trafficking is illegal and rare. We do have one of those right there, Sweden. Trafficking is illegal, problems still exist, including the United States. Darker green, trafficking is illegal but still practiced throughout Central Asia. And darker countries, trafficking is limitedly illegal and is practiced. And the darkest countries of all, trafficking is not illegal and is commonly practiced. You see there, a lot of the Middle East nations. We also have sex ratios, which actually engendered some surprise. We looked at the sex ratios of the world, looking at childhood sex ratios and looking at degree of son preference. And we developed a scale on that, and you see that what's interesting is that in some of the nations of the world, such as China, you may not have such a bad picture in terms of trafficking and even violence of women against women. But that's assuming you can be born. And we do have some interesting countries, some in Eastern Europe and even Portugal, where, at least according to the census bureaus of their countries, they have abnormal childhood sex ratios, which we'd like to look into more. But you can see how you really do need kind of a multi-dimensional look at women before you can make judgments about the status and the situation of women. So I would like to end by saying that I am really proud of how Brigham Young University has supported our project. The David M. Kennedy Center, the Women's Research Institute, the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences has given us the money to begin and to maintain this project on behalf of women. And I believe it is so appropriate that Brigham Young University is leading out on what promises to be the most comprehensive database on the status of women in the world. And thank you very much for allowing me to speak to you on that. Ideologically. We are in Provo, Utah. You know what we're going to say. I know you. You're a former student of mine, aren't you? You're looking a lot more distinguished than I remember you in my class.
Waiting on you now.
Well, of course, the place of safety is the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. Where else is there a place that proclaims that the differences between men and women are real and are wonderful, but yet at the same time insists that there is no inferiority or superiority between men and women? I honestly don't believe that we, generally speaking as Latter-day Saints, live up to that incredible privilege. There's almost no other people in the world that are willing to say that gender is an eternal characteristic, but at the same time that men and women stand before each other and before the Lord as equals. Do you remember what Elder L. Tom Perry said in 2004? Was it 2004? He said, "There is not a president and a vice president in our families. There are co-presidents working together for the eternal good of their families." Can you imagine if we plastered that on a billboard in the capital cities of the world? Okay? What a remarkable statement, that our general authorities have made and continue to make on a lot of these issues. I want to go out and preach the gospel once I'm done raising my children, because I want to improve the status of women. And I think that missionary activity is the best way that I can do that, aside from this.
Continue the questions from former students. I had a question in terms of the impact of culture on people who are being baptized into the church. You've outlined some pretty powerful forces at play in each of these various cultural settings. There's the ideal gospel teaching, but there's the reality of transforming people who come from cultural backgrounds that differ, bring that baggage with them. What kind of an impact does that have on that process?
Well, it slows it down. But that's what the church is. I mean, we've been in church meetings all over the world, sub-Saharan Africa and China and Mongolia and wherever, and there's a differential, but everyone's talking the same language, the same conceptual framework, and we do see changes. People who join the church, and we see them a few years later, and how that has changed their family tremendously. And the church is an education.
Even on gender relations.
Definitely on gender relations. Before I joined the church, I remember going to a chapel, and I noticed two things more than anything else that just stuck in my head. One was the little kids running all over the place, and it would seem to be irreverence to me, coming from a traditional religion. But then I noticed, to my shock, fathers picking up their babies, taking them out, working with them. And I had never seen that before. Now you're starting to see that in China. About 10 years ago, with the one child, you began to see younger Chinese men spending a lot of time with their children and being real fathers in an LDS perspective. But I know this was shocking to me. I had never seen this. To you younger people, I mean, you've grown up in the church, and this is the rule, but it's not the rule anyplace else. You are a very unusual group of men, and I think it's very important for men and young boys to stand up for women. And I think LDS men have a particular God-given responsibility to do that because of our doctrine. And I think it's very important to never forget that.
There seems to be a perception outside the church that the LDS church is sexist.
Yeah, I had it myself, in fact.
Well, I think it comes from this notion that women should stay home, they should care for their children.
Barefoot and pregnant.
Barefoot, pregnant, in the kitchen. How does the church get around that? What are things that they can do?
Raise the question for the
Yeah, he's, okay.
He asked, he said that even in the United States, the LDS Church is seen as sexist. And how even in our own culture do we get around that? And I think there's several responses that can be made. With other cultures, I think the men in this room here can do a lot of gentle teaching. For example, the first International Society meeting that I ever attended was in 1992, and Elder Alexander Morrison was there. And his theme was that the church will never bow down before any traditions that demean or devalue the daughters of God. And he went on to talk about how he, as a priesthood leader, would enforce that gently. For example, when he went to sub-Saharan Africa, the men might be sitting near the podium underneath a canopy, and the women and children might be sitting out on the dirt under the sun. And he would just simply gently say, "We will not start the meeting until families are seated together." In other teaching of leadership, he challenged a group of sub-Saharan African priesthood leaders to stand up at a priesthood dinner and talk about how important their wife was to their own spirituality. And those who had been sent from the church, of course, spoke first. But it was amazing what an incredible teaching moment it was to have a man in a position of priesthood authority say to another man, "Please tell us how important your wife is to your spirituality." Men talking to men, I think, is an incredible situation. Now, in the United States, it doesn't help. Not men talking to men and women, men in the church talking to men and women outside the church, I'm not sure. I think here is where the voice of women in the church is so important. I believe that it is up to us to talk about how we do not feel that our church is sexist. And I think that we are not able to do so right now. And the reason I think that's true is I think, generally speaking, as a people, we have still not lived up to our privileges of this immense pearl of great price. To know that God means an exalted man and an exalted woman married together forever. And that heaven consists of family and eternal increase. These types of amazing things, I don't think we really think about them and teach them as much as we should to our young men. And our young women as well. I went to a young women's meeting once. I was asked to talk. And I asked them what the powers of the priesthood were. And you know what? They enumerated them all. And then I asked them what powers they had. And they were speechless. They had no idea. They had nothing. So are we creating an articulateness or not? And if not, why not?